Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the Fall 2025 Dr. Thomas and Albert J. Shipka Speaker Series. We're happy to have you all join us today. And before introducing our speaker, let me first say a few things about the people that this series honors. The Shipka Speaker Series honors a father and son, Al Shipka and Dr. Tom Shipka. After graduating from Camel Memorial High School in 1932, Al Shipka was a steel worker in the Camel Works of the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company. As the years passed, he became the president of his local union, a member of the staff and assistant director of the United Steel Workers of America, District 26, president of the Greater Youngstown AFL-CIO, and the first representative of organized labor to be appointed to the YSU Board of Trustees. Al passed away in 1975. His son, Tom Shipka, earned a PhD in philosophy from Boston College and served on the YSU full-time faculty from 1969 to 2006. He helped organize and lead the faculty union from 1971 to 1986, chaired the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies from 1986 to 2006, and served as a fundraiser for both academics and athletics throughout his YSU career. He received the Distinguished Professor Award 3 times for teaching and scholarship, including a widely used text for introductory philosophy. His gifts to YSU include an endowed scholarship for a student athlete. Dr. Shipka was inducted to the YSU Athletics Hall of Fame as a contributor in 2004 and the YSU Heritage Society in 2009. If you look at the YSU Heritage Society, that's sort of the most prestigious honor that the university can bestow on somebody. But I'm pretty sure if you asked Tom which one he cared more about, it's the YSU Athletics Hall of Fame. So just so you know where he is, right? One of Dr. Shipka's fundraising activities was a group we call the Philosophy Circle. The Philosophy Circle is a generous group of donors who've made it possible for the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences to bring world-class speakers like Dr. Pettit to YSU. Tom actually had surgery earlier in the week, so he can't be with us today. But I ask that you please all join me in thanking Tom for all of his efforts, both for YSU faculty, staff, and the greater Youngstown community. So, nice show. We invite you all to join us upstairs on the 3rd floor for refreshments after the talk. As a final reminder before introducing our speaker, please silence your cell phones. Come on in, you're good. There are handouts up here at the front, so if you missed one coming in, run up and grab one, or someone grab some and pass them around, or I'll grab them when I'm done with the introduction. I'm actually very excited about today's speaker. Our speaker is, of course, Dr. Philip Pettit. Dr. Pettit is the L.S. Rockefeller Professor of Human Values at Princeton and Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at the Australian National University. In looking over Dr. Pettit's CV, it's actually kind of hard to find an honor that he hasn't received or a prestigious lecture that he has not given. By the numbers, he's impressive. He's 24 books, either authored or co-authored, 10 volumes edited or co-edited, and over 140 papers published. I think it's actually well over 140 papers published. And that's the numbers, but those numbers don't really talk about his real impact, which goes far beyond those numbers. One of his books, Republicanism, and it's a much longer title, but that's the core bit, has been translated into 17 languages and provided the philosophical foundation for political reforms in Spain under José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero. The heart of these reforms was a Republican notion of freedom as non-domination. Some reforms based on this idea included expanded rights for vulnerable groups, that's same-sex marriage, laws against domestic violence, and immigrant protections. Laws that allowed for greater local control, which was particularly important in the Spanish region of Catalonia, which, if you know Spanish history, is a big deal. And increased public oversight with freedom of information, independence of state media, and greater public access to government information. Those reforms we discussed this morning at breakfast, and they are holding, so they're still active, right? Dr. Pettit's most known for developing and defending civic republicanism and political philosophy and theory. In fact, I don't think that it's too strong to say that he's the most responsible for the current discussions of Republican theory and political philosophy. I've used several of his books in my own classes. I've engaged with his work in my own writing. And I'm also pleased to finally have a Shipka speaker who believes in handouts instead of PowerPoint, like myself. In his talk today, The What, the Why, and the How of Democracy, he'll look at some of the most important elements of democratic government, and issue a call for retention of the Republican tradition of the founders of the United States as something worth pursuing. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Philip Pettit.
Am I on? I'm happy to use that, actually.
You're good there. Just like it is.
Okay, am I on?
Yes.
Yes, very good, in every sense. Well, I'm delighted to be here, and I wish to join with Alan in thanking the Shipkas for sponsoring this lecture. I think it's to someone's great credit that they invest in an occasion like this. I'm not sure I'm going to make it worthwhile, but I'll certainly try, and I'm very, very glad to be at Youngstown State University and to learn something about Youngstown as a place, which I found quite charming, I must say. But in any case, to business. So the what, the why, and the how of democracy is... So let's get straight into it with the what. The what. I guess nowadays, you ask most people, what does it mean to say that a system is democratic? And many people will say it means simply that there's an electoral system, a periodic, open, competitive electoral system that determines who are going to occupy what you might call the domain general positions in government. That is to say, those in the legislature, and often those in the administration. And that's certainly true of the United States, where we elect the president as well as electing to the houses of Congress. That actually is interesting, an understanding of the word democracy that only dates back to about 1830s, 1840s, and actually emerged mainly in America, because up to then, the word democracy was a bad word. I'll come to that in a moment. But the identification of democracy with a representative electoral system of the kind we're all familiar with, that sort of became cemented, not just in, I think, common awareness, but also in political science. So I think I have quotations from, well, Adam Tversky, who's a political scientist on the left, so to speak, and then Joseph Schumpeter, who is, of course, a very influential figure more on the right in the 1940s. Schumpeter really made it almost canonical in political science that you just define democracy by having an electoral system under which parties compete for power. This appeals in a way, for methodological reasons. You can count the number of democracies in the world. But of course, most of us sort of worry a bit about that, because if you counted democracies by that particular criterion, then I think a lot of systems might count as democracies that most of us would really have severe misgivings about counting as democracy. What has been much better, by the way, is if you look at the indices of democracy that are put out by various organizations, such as the Economist Index of Democracy. It's got about 60 criteria that a functioning democracy ought to do well on, and much more than just election. However, I'm going to ignore that for the moment. The reason up to the 1830s or so, with a couple of exceptions, I should say, but the reason why the word democracy was a bad word is that it had been invented, or I should say reinvented, in the 15 and 1600s, the 16th and 17th centuries, by figures who identify themselves as absolutists. One figure of this kind you'll all certainly know the name of is Thomas Hobbes, but he was following a French absolutist known as Jean Bodin, B-O-D-I-N, and their argument, and of course this was a time of great civil strife in Europe, but their argument was that you had to have a single center of power in a state if you were going to stop civil war. And remember, this is post-Reformation. There's a lot of religious and civil strife and so on in various countries. Their ideal, of course, was that you'd have one person, a monarch, in charge. But in the course of arguing for having a monarch in charge, they, so to speak, throw a sop to those who think, well, that cuts out too many people. And they say, well, of course, there is democracy. And then they define democracy as a system, as they saw, that we give ordinary people a chance, but they defined it as follows. They said, in a democracy, you have to have all the citizens come together. Now, of course, the citizens at those days would certainly have just meant only men, and probably only propertied men, but nonetheless a substantial number. All the citizens would come together and would decide every law, every measure by vote. That's what they said democracy is. And of course, they put in circulation a conception of democracy such that no one wanted that, mainly because, of course, it looked very infeasible, except in very small city-states. So, for example, the only one who defended anything ever like that in the 18th century, in the 1700s, was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. But he really thought that that sort of system, and his has various changes, I should say, to, but it's broadly a Hobbesian democracy, is to, he wanted to argue that it could only work in a city like Geneva, which was where he was originally from. So there was, most people would have said democracy in that sense, and now it became the main sense of the word. We don't want a bar of it. We don't want anything to do with it. And among those people who rejected it were often very radical figures, like, for example, the founders in the United States. So you pick up the federal papers and you'll find a denunciation of democracy. But you've got to understand that it's rejecting Hobbesian democracy, a democracy that would require all the citizens to come together. What they defend is a representative system. Of course, what we would call democracy by the contemporary sense. I just mentioned that is particularly important because many people nowadays say, oh, the founders were not for democracy, so what's all this big thing about democracy? I fear we'll hear that from more and more. But remember, it's not democracy in our sense, that the representative system sense, if you accept that, it's not democracy in that sense that was being rejected by the founders. It's democracy in the Hobbesian sense. But there was a third conception of democracy in the history of political thought. And interestingly, you've got to go from the 1500s back about, I got to count now, more than 1,000 years, 2,000 years in effect, to find it in usage. And of course, it was the Greek usage of the word. They invented the word, they called it demokratia, from demos meaning people, and kratia meaning power. And they meant by democracy any system that actually gave considerable power to ordinary people. They did not define democracy, notice, by any means whereby you might think people had power. Either the participatory means of the assembly envisaged by Hobbes. Of course, Hobbes and his like, they defined democracy that way because they wanted to make it as unattractive as possible. They were supporters of monarchy. But equally, they didn't think that democracy required elections. Think now, if I asked you, and I'm sure you'd all have an answer, what city in Greece do you think the Greeks at that time, we're talking about 500-600 before the Common Era, would have thought of as the exemplar democracy, the model democracy? They would have all said Athens, But Athens did not have elections, and while there was an assembly of citizens that met quite regularly, actually almost every week, that assembly was not allowed to make law. It wasn't the lawmaking. It wasn't anything like Hobbesian democracy. In fact, most positions of power in Athens were appointed to on the basis of a lottery. So it was very different from either an electoral or a participatory system, either a representative or a participatory system. On the other hand, it's a notion of democracy that everyone really would accept, including in the representative and the participatory stamp. They don't say, well, we're identifying about the means of achieving goal, but they say, of course, what democracy is about is giving control to ordinary people. I should qualify about Joseph Schumpeter, but I'm not going to do so. Maybe it'll come up in the Q&A. So I suggest to you that we should think about democracy in the Greek way, which just simply says it's a system under which people enjoy, and this was all an assumption, an adequate and more or less equal degree of control over what government does. I think we should all accept that Greek original understanding of democracy. Now, going on, that's the what question. Answered, tick, I hope. The why question. So why would you want that? Why would you want a way in which government might be controlled under a system of control that gave equal access to ordinary people? Well, the reason you'd want that, and now I'm going to draw on a long tradition, the Republican tradition that goes right back to ancient Rome, that did not use the word democracy, but certainly defended what we would call, and what by the Greek sense would count as, democratic institutions. So, for example, the reason, why didn't they use the word democracy? Well, first of all, it was a Greek word, and most of the authors, though Greek was a common language in the Roman Republic and later Empire, Latin was the language, so to speak, of those who wrote about these things. And they preferred the word republic, or res publica, a public affair. They said government should be a public affair. Really what they meant by that is that it should be a democracy in the Greek sense. It should be a system under which ordinary people have considerable shared and equal control over government. Okay, in that tradition, you get a great defense, so to speak, of the democratic idea, albeit it's described as a republican idea. And the word that they always use of a government that is not living up to that ideal, that is making government a private affair rather than a public affair, that is taking the power of government away from the control of ordinary people, the word they all use, at least in the English translations that became, because republicanism in that sense spread throughout Europe rapidly in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance, places like Venice, for example, and Florence in northern Italy, and especially in other countries in Europe like Poland, for example, or Holland, the Netherlands, the Dutch Republic, or the English Republic, remember, of the 17th century. The word that came to be used in English was arbitrariness. You do not want an arbitrary power in government. And what that meant for them was you don't want government to have a power. We know it imposes on us. Government makes laws, government enforces laws, government judges laws. Government is really important. It's a big power of coercion in our lives, but we do not want government, that's their thought, to be such that those in power, those in office, could exercise the powers they have in a way that is simply disregards the wishes and the opinions of its people, even some of its people. And if it did have such power to act at will, so to speak, in imposing laws, in enforcing them, in judging them, then it would be acting according to its arbitrium or its own will or judgment. It would be an arbitrary government. You wanted to reduce arbitrariness in those who have power over us, and you wanted them to be able to make laws, of course, but only to make laws under constraints that are imposed by ordinary people, by the people on whom the laws are actually imposed. Okay, in that way of thinking about, democracy, it's obviously going to be very important to ask, well, when would a democracy of that kind be thought to be working well? Well, it's accepted in that tradition, as we must surely all accept too, that if we are to have some control over what government does in our lives, and by the way, I'll use government in this context to include the legislature, the executive, the administration, but also the courts and the various bodies surrounding these main central bodies. I describe the legislature and the executive as domain general authorities because they decide things on a whole range of issues. The courts are more domain specific than domain general because they've got a special job, which is to determine what the law requires in this case or that case, or whether the laws passed by the houses of Congress and the president are actually coherent with the Constitution. That's their very specific job. But in government, as we know it, there are lots of other domain-specific authorities as well, apart from the courts, for example, regulatory authorities, authorities like the Fed, the central bank, and this is true of almost every advanced democracy, authorities like the sources of information, like the Bureau of Statistics, the various Bureau of Statistics, or the centers of economic information. Okay, so I'm including all of those under government, and here's the thing that any theory of democracy, any account of why we want democracy, and I'm coming to that, any account is going to have to admit, which is that, well, no one can control government on their own, of course, or expect to control it, and no one can expect everyone else to agree with them in how government should be controlled, and no one can expect to be regarded as special, whether especially superior or inferior. And now, under those assumptions, the idea of democracy, of popular control that you find in the long tradition, right down to, and including very much the American founders, is the idea that government should be responsive to people as individuals. It should operate in making its decision-making on a base that displays equal respect for all of those on whom the laws are going to be applied. What might be a good test of whether democracy is working well? And we can think about ideals, if you like, here. Now, we're not necessarily thinking about, because you might say there is no ideal democracy on earth, but what would be a test of a democracy working ideally well? Well, it wouldn't be that everybody is satisfied with the laws that are passed. Because in a community where people have different interests, and of course different opinions, for which you can read almost any human community, I would say, in such a community, there are always going to be laws that some are dissatisfied with. In fact, for every law, you can be pretty sure there's going to be some group in society that are very unhappy with it. Maybe because it goes against their interests. It's a law that maybe imposes a special tax on those in their industry, and they'd much prefer it's imposed on somebody else, and they're very dissatisfied with the law. So no one can expect, we can't expect, that any system of democratic control should give people equal satisfaction in the laws passed. But equally, we can't expect that a system of control would give people even equal influence on the decisions made. You can have a system of control under which we've got equal access to, as we're operating the levers, but some are going to prove, even in the most ideal system, are going to prove more influential than others. So even if even if you were working with a committee that discusses everything and makes its decisions, even if government were like that, the sort of Hobbesian image, it's still the case that some people would be more persuasive than others, some would be better at building coalitions with others, some would be more influential. So you can't have a test of democracy that says we should be equally satisfied with the laws or we should have equal influence under the system. You can't have that. So what would be a good test of an ideal democracy? Well, people sometimes reach for, I think, a very elusive and dangerous notion, actually, which is to say, well, if provided government is operating by the people's will, where the idea is that the will of the people is something as where the people are treated as a blob, a single agent, and then we have the idea of their having a will, and that will, if it's displayed in the elections, some people will say, well, that's the will of the people. And that's why a democracy is a good democracy if it really is electorally, for example, impeccable, and it puts in power those who have policies that answers to the will of the people as expressed in the elections. That can't be very good, can it? And the reason why, obviously, is that what counts as the popular will is going to vary depending on what electoral system you're using. So if you change the boundaries of the districts, for example, between one election and another, you may get a different result in terms of who's elected, what policies are put in power, so to speak, from what you would get had those districts not been changed in that way. But equally, the various rules of voting, as you vary them, it turns out, well, what is the popular will? Is it the one that shows up under this electoral system, under that electoral system, under this variation on the rules of the district boundaries, or under that variation? And you realize, well, this is a will of the wisp. There is nothing. I didn't mean to pun, but actually it's quite a good pun, isn't it? The popular will is a will of the wisp. It's something wholly elusive. It's, in the bad sense, it's wholly metaphysical. It's beyond the reach of the empirical or the determinable. So that's no test of whether democracy is a good democracy. So let me suggest a test to you that I think fits with the tradition quite well. And it's what I call the tough luck test. And so here's how I think of it. Suppose we live in this ideal democracy, ideal in the sense that there's a system of control, and this system of control of government is, let that pass for the moment, is adequate, and it's relatively equal. We've all got the same degree of access, at least in principle, to operating this system. If you had such a system, and it was really adequately controlling government, laws would be passed, measures, policies would be adopted, decisions would be made by the courts, and so on. Under such a system, it would be constrained by the people. They would operate, as you might say, if the system is working well, on the people's terms. The people wouldn't be dictating everything that should be done, that's impossible. But they'd be setting, so to speak, the limits and the constraints under which things should be done. And if that were the case, then what would display how satisfactory it is? And I want to say the following. There's still going to be people, even under that system, who are going to be very dissatisfied with the system. There's still going to be people who feel they should have had more influence than other people had in the final determination of the result. But if people really believe that they're operating under a system that gives them equal access and so on, that this controls what government does, then they won't be able to think, they'll have good reason not to think, that look, this law that was passed that I don't like is just imposed on me and my ilk because that law, another sector of society, are really controlling what's happening and we're under their will. If the system is working well, we wouldn't be able to think that. We'd have to acknowledge that how things turned out was a result of a perfectly good system, an impartial system insofar as it's controlled or subject to the control equally of all of us. It was passed under that system. And we just have to accept, well, that was tough luck, that the law was one we didn't like, or that the law was one that went against our interests, that the decision of the executive was one that put the prison in our backyard, that the decision of the courts was one that didn't actually go our way. We'd have to accept that even in those cases where we are disappointed, and with good reason disappointed, we at least have no reason for being resentful. Resentment is appropriate when there's the will of another agent or a group that's imposing on you. You get angry because, you don't get angry with the hurricane, even though you would be very disappointed, very flattened and depressed by the hurricane, but there's no will there, so you don't resent the hurricane, but you can resent a person or a group of people. If the system was working well, then I think even those dissatisfied with the laws or their degree of influence as they see it on the passing of a law would still at least be able to admit it's not cause for resentment. It's just something, that's how the cookie crumbles. That's what would be the appropriate way to think. Now, if that gives us an image of why we might want democracy and what makes it attractive in the ideal, that of course pushes us onto the question, well, tell me about a system that might deliver something approximating that result. Maybe we can't ever get something that perfectly aligns with that result, but maybe we could at least aim at a system that would do that. And I want to suggest to you is that in the long tradition, going right back to Athens, but also in the Roman tradition and in the form it took in the northern Italian city republics, for example, of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and the European republics, like the Dutch and English Republic, and in the constitutional republic that followed that followed 1688 in England, and of course, above all, in the American way of thinking. That was really the core idea, that we want a system that we each, so to speak, have enough control over, together with others, to feel that when a law is against us, that's just tough luck. That's not a cause for resentment. Okay, so now with the how of democracy, in that long tradition, I would say 5 elements stand out. First of all, an assumption that government must operate under a constitution, a mode of organization. This was called by very different names in different traditions. Usually the constitution is regarded as unwritten rather than written, and it was unwritten. After all, it was the American Republic, which was the first great country, so to speak, that adopted a written constitution, but for a century or more previously, people had hailed the British Constitution as the greatest constitution on earth and had regarded it as almost a quasi-republic. And it had a king, but it gave a lot of people a lot of power to, well, ordinary citizens, except they weren't so ordinary in the British case. Okay, in that system, there's always, in that tradition, there's always an assumption. You've got to have a constitution that lays down the laws, the decision-maker laws, the rules under which those who govern have got to operate. If it was unwritten, it existed as conventions that no one would think of breaching. So, for example, in England, a convention like habeas corpus, that no one could be locked up, so to speak, at will and kept at will. That was simply constitutional. It was unthinkable. And, you know, the courts interpreted what they took to be constitutional principles. So, for example, in 1768, I think, a famous court in Britain declared that no one could be a slave on British soil, as an interpretation of the Constitution, as laid down in the long tradition of lawmaking. Anyhow, that was the first thing, that a constitution should be there. Now, from the Americans on particularly, it was accepted this constitution should be satisfactory in 2 ends. On the one end, it should be under the control of the people, because after all, the best constitution in the world, under changed circumstances, might serve the people not so well as you might have expected, and the people should have the power of changing it. But it was always assumed it should be difficult to change it, because if, so to speak, you've got different sides in politics, then you'd better have the rules of the game difficult enough to change so that neither side can capture those rules and use them and bend them to their own will. And so in the American tradition, in the Constitution, we have Article 5 that allows us as a people to change the Constitution, but only with great difficulty. Now, my personal feeling is that we made it too difficult in America to change the Constitution, but it's a good idea to have some, as people call it often, a super-majoritarian control rather than straight majority control over the Constitution. But the assumption is you have to have a Constitution that dictates who is to be in government, what they are to do, and under what constraints they are to do it. And that Constitution should be subject to popular control itself, albeit only supermajority control. But in the tradition, the assumption was that a Constitution should also be satisfactory on another end, and that was that it should enable control by the people over other aspects of government, over how government acts under the Constitution, over how the legislature and the executive and the courts, for example, act under the Constitution. And there were two categories of institutions that Constitution, so to speak, put in place in the tradition. On the one side, the one category, it brought in institutions that made government controllable, institutions that meant that government would be subject to enough constraints in how it operated that at least you could begin to think of the people constraining it further so as to make it operate on their terms. And the other category is the channels of control that the Constitution would give people, ordinary people, over government. Aside, the institutions designed to make government controllable, there are again two varieties. One is the checks and balances, and the other is the rule of law institutions. So way back, the idea was that government is going to be uncontrollable unless you have different centers of power, different holders of different offices, or maybe different holders of the same office, who can check and balance one another. Polybius, who was the one who really made the Romans aware about 150 BCE that really they had a very special republic, he praised it mainly for the fact that no one could seize power on their own. So, for example, in ancient Rome, only those in the senatorial elite could hold office, as you might say, administrative office, but ordinary people had to elect them to those offices. Rome did have elections. Again, only those in office, with the support of and certainly advice of the Senate, could pass laws, but it turned out people had to approve of the laws they passed in different sorts of bodies that they identified in ancient Rome. It also turned out that within the administration, there were many levels of authority. At the top were the consuls, we all know about. At the bottom were the quaestors. There had to be two consuls elected. And of course, they checked and balanced one another, and that was the idea. And similarly, there were 40 quaestors. You increased the number, so to speak, of competing administrators in any level of authority as you came down the hierarchy. But the whole idea was put checks and balances in place. They were terrified of the idea of an absolute monarchy, which of course had been in Rome. The ancient king of Rome, Tarquin, had been thrown out in the early 500s BCE, and Rome developed a system under which no one could seize monarchical power. That was the main focus on that. And that became a long motif in the Western tradition of celebrating popular control, or celebrating republican government, as it was called in various European countries and, of course, in America as well. And we know what a system of checks and balances in our system is. Well, legislature, executive, and the courts, they're relatively independent of one another. The most important of all is that the court should be independent of the other bodies, and almost all advanced democracies today have an independent judiciary. So all have a system of checks and balances in that sense. But apart from that, within almost all advanced democratic systems today, there's a recognition that there are certain jobs that those we elect, for example, if we elect them to the main general office, have got a conflict of interest in deciding. And with those issues, most democracies have passed the issues over to domain-specific bodies rather than leaving them with the elected authorities. Number one, though in America, sadly, except in some states we don't have it, is an electoral commission that will determine district boundaries and will determine the rules under which elections take place. I think America may be now about the only advanced democracy that lacks an independent authority, domain-specific, of people who determine the electoral rules and how they apply. A second would be, of course, the determination of interest rates. We do give that to an independent body, that is the Fed, the central bank, as it's called in most countries. And in those cases, why would you give jobs to those people and take them away from those who are elected? Well, because those who are elected have an obvious interest, you know. I'm afraid it's so salient in our own country here that politicians have a salient conflict of interest when it comes to devising electoral boundaries. They ought to be devised to promote democracy, not to promote the interests of any one party. And of course, it's totally natural that if you give elected officials charge over that, they'll try to bend them in their favor. And that's been true of both sides of politics in this country for a long time. We haven't got around to doing what most other democracies have done. Equally with interest rates, of course, government have always an interest in keeping them down, and so we'll want to control interest rates, but that can be very bad longer term for the democracy. Other jobs in the checks and balances system, well, you need auditors of government, financial, legal, ethical auditors of government. And there are various bodies of this kind. But you also need, for example, bodies that give information about government, the Bureau of Statistics, the offices that the Congressional Budget Office, you know, that actually put a cost on various policies. And where that office operates independently from the influence of those elected, because those elected will always have an interest in making the news sound good. So if you're going to have a democracy under which people can't have any control over government, government has got to be itself controllable. And I think an obvious way of achieving that is to have a genuine system of checks and balances. A second way of achieving the tradition is by a rule of law. What does a rule of law do? Well, it insists, for example, that all the laws that are passed should be general, applying to people in general as far as possible, not to a particular targeted group, that they should be fairly stable, they shouldn't chop and change too much, and that what the courts say is the law is the same as what the executive say is the law, that the voices should be uniform. It also requires, of course, that we should know the laws, and the laws should be such that we can understand them, and the laws should be such, above all, that we can follow them, so they're not retroactive, for example. That's the core of a rule of law idea. It goes right back to, I would say, Athens, actually, not just to Rome. And of course, other aspects of it is that those who are operating, in order to establish that they are operating under rule of law, should be able to give reasons for their decisions. That's what's so disappointing about the fact that, now it will be put right, they tell us in time, so it's only a temporary blemish, but the Supreme Court has so often recently made shadow docket decisions. That's to say, made decisions without giving the reasons for and against. So, you know, we just don't know what the reasoning is. Now, insofar as that became an established habit, either in the court of the administrators or the legislators or the judges, this government would not be controllable by us. They have to be prepared to give their reasons if we are going to share any sort of control. Okay, those are the two elements in the tradition whereby you make the government controllable, the checks and balances system, and the rule of law system. They're part and parcel of the idea of democracy. They should not be shoved aside. That's the thing I would most like to emphasize, really, in this discussion of the how of democracy. But of course, the Constitution should not only make room for controlling the government by means of checks and balances and rule of law, it should also empower ordinary people in order for them to be able to exercise some sort of control, impose some sort of constraints over this hopefully well-controllable government, as you might describe it. And of course, the two channels of possible control, they're fairly obvious on a moment's reflection. One channel, and it may not be the more obvious of the two, is what I call the contestatory channel. It is deeply important in any democracy that we ordinary people can contest what government is doing. We can do it individually, we can do it in smaller groups, we could do it, if that ever arose, in unanimous collective sort of groups. But that sort of contestation can occur in the courts, under the law itself, under the Constitution. It can occur in the media, of course, and it can occur on the streets, if needs be. And the fact that we, the people, can exercise that sort of contestation, that's really important. That's the sort of active control. Now, you might say, well, when one person takes the government to the courts, for example, for an alleged breach of the Constitution, that's not the people. Well, I would say it is, insofar as we, the people, stand by a law that allows any individual to do that. That's a sort of active contestation. But of course, governments in a well-functioning democracy are always going to be also controlled by a sort of standby form of contestation, because the very fact that those in government know that if they go that direction in policy making, they're going to have huge opposition, maybe in the courts, in the media, or on the streets. Then it may give them reason to pull back. But that means the people have already exercised a sort of contestatory control in the very fact of that being anticipated by government and inhibiting government. But apart from that sort of more hands-on, you might say, contestation by the people, we the people exercise also a sort of contestatory influence over government insofar as they're agencies, so to speak, that we license and that do that job for us. Those agencies may be within government, like ombudsman bodies of various kinds. They can exercise, as were a contestatory pushback on our behalf. We actually have to trigger the ombudsman, but you can have other bodies that act in the name of the people. For example, inspectors general, in traditional departments of government. They hopefully only temporarily have been suspended, but that's an important way in which, by proxy, so to speak, we the people can know that those in, say, elected office are being held to the terms that we might expect them to operate on. Okay, apart from the contestatory channel of control, of course, there's a selectional channel of control. And the most obvious selectional channel of control here is election. And I think election is the best way of indeed appointing to what I've been calling domain general offices, legislative and administrative. The offices of people who have power over a whole range of issues, don't have a very specific job to do. Why is it the best method of selection? Well, the founding fathers, God bless them, as you might say, thought that elections would select the brightest and the best. I don't believe it does. In any country in the world does election select the brightest and the best, but I still stand by the importance of election. Actually, for reasons that Joseph Schumpeter, whom I cited earlier, would deeply applaud. And the reason is that when you've got a system under which people have got to compete for this domain general power, parties have got to compete in particular, then if they accept the system, It's so important that they accept it. But if they accept it, as Schumpeter argued, then of course they themselves have to claim rights of freedom of speech. They themselves have got to claim rights of freedom of association. They themselves have got to demand that information is available, as through these independent bureaus, about how the past government, for example, performed. And that means they're going to, maybe the most happiest phrase, they've got to vote with their feet in favor of these really important freedoms. Why are they really important? Well, they're really important, in any case, to make contestation possible. Because when people are afraid, are intimidated, when they are not so sure they can say this and get away with it, or associate with this or that group and get away with it, then they cease to be contestatory people. They become a cowed people. And the importance of election, in a way, and the acceptance of the electoral system on all sides, is that it's going to, as it were, force all sides to really commit to these freedoms. Election, I think, is also important because it reminds us, the people, of how we can act together. You know, we do go to the polls together. It's a joint action of sustaining a system under which the majority gains power, sustaining democracy. And we each vote only because we believe other people will vote. We vote on different sides. But insofar as we accept the rules, what we together are doing, though we're competing with one another about who's in power, is supporting a system under which those who win the elections gain power. And it's like, you know, two people play tennis. They're jointly contributing to a result they all want, which is they have a pleasant afternoon. But they compete like anything with one another for who's going to win. You know, the joint action of that kind can nest competitive action. And it's very important to see election. It nests the competition between the parties. But by Jove, it's got this jointly, presumably welcome and sought effect of keeping it the case that power is not passed on via dynasty or via the will of the existing power holder. It's passed on on the basis of the decision we make. Now, I should stop because I'm just very close to 45 minutes. One last point, you might say, well, if election is so good with the domain general authorities, why not have elections for judges, which does happen at some levels in some states, in the United States, in which I think lamentably Mexico has just voted for, as a general system of appointing judges. Or why not appoint by election to the central bank, to the Fed, or to any of these other bodies, the regulatory bodies, the Bureau of Statistics, and so on? Why not have those elected? I think it only takes a minute's reflection to realize why you don't want judges, for example, elected. And that is to say, judges have got a very specific job to do, which is to interpret the law as it stands on a given issue. When you elect them, you give them a separate motive, the motive of wanting to be re-elected. And that can only warp, so to speak, the impartiality of the judge and undermine the very point of the system. And I think that's true across a range of unelected authorities. But of course, that they're unelected doesn't mean that we, the people, have no control over their appointment. If the appointments are transparent, if they have to meet various constraints in the appointment, if they've got to operate under various constraints that we ultimately license and support, then that, of course, is a great control. And if we are positioned to contest, maybe raise just a hullabaloo, if there's widespread dissatisfaction with some appointments, for example, well, that already means that even though it's an appointment system of selection rather than electoral, it can still be widely under popular control, as you might say. That's more or less where I have to end, but I just say one thing, which is this tradition I've described of thinking that democracy is just about giving people shared, more or less equal control over government, that
It's essential because otherwise you're going to get particular sort of groups, elites, or individuals ruling according to their will arbitrarily, that's to say, with indifference to the will or the opinions of at least some in their population. And when it comes to the how, the long tradition really has it in insisting you've got to have a constitution that determines who holds various offices, the constraints under which they operate, and so on. A constitution that is under supermajority, popular control, but a constitution above all that renders government controllable by putting checks and balances and a rule of law in place, and that gives ordinary people a degree of control by establishing channels of contestatory and selectional control. I'll stop at that point. Thank you very much.